All right, happy Saturday, everyone. I am going to attempt to make a sourdough stout bread. I'm going to use Nitro Milk Stout. Here we go, by Left Hand Brewing Company. I was planning on using Guinness, but unfortunately, all the Guinness in the apartment is gone. I don't know how that happened. So I'm following a recipe by King Arthur Flour Company, kind of, and then kind of combining that with the last time I made sourdough for some of the steps. But I was able to find Rye Flakes on Amazon. The recipe itself calls for wheat flakes, which I couldn't find, and I'm just hoping this works. Who knows? So thank you, Homebrew Ohio, for these rye flakes. And the first step is to make what's called a soaker. So this is 1 cup of my rye flakes, and I have boiling water from the kettle. And I'm taking 1 cup of the rye flake and just adding a 1/2 cup of boiling water, and then just gonna set that aside. And that is quote unquote going to be called the soaker. I'm guessing that is enough. It says it is. Okay. Now, just mix that together. So all of the rye flakes, oh, that smells nice, get nice and wet. Okay. That's good enough. There. Perfect. So we'll set this aside for the moment. There. Okay, so then the next step is to get my active starter. We're going to need a cup of that, and then a cup and 2 tablespoons of the beer, and then about 3.5 cups or 426 grams of the flour. So I'm going to try and measure everything out with my scale here. I have my starter, which is actually still active and bubbly. It actually exploded on the stove. So, you know, fortunately, unfortunately, this is the starter that began April 1st. I cooked my first loaf on the 10th or the 11th. I put the mother in the fridge to rest, and then I brought her back out yesterday, fed it, and then it exploded a little bit. And then I did a discard, fed it again, got another explosion. So thank you, Mary. So it's all good there. Get nice and bubbly. The rubber band, it kind of represented how full it was. Based on the explosion on the stove, I think that it is more than ready. And so once I'm done with this today, I'll again take 25 grams of this mother, keep it in this jar, pop it in the fridge. The rest I'm going to add to my discard. And I made some lovely sourdough crackers that Barry likes. So this is my discard jar. Made sourdough crackers, so far my favorite. I made sourdough biscuits. Those are only okay. Come from a Southern family. I'm very particular about my biscuits. So anyway, next step, we need a cup of our fed sourdough. So per the recipe, it says that I should weigh out the flour before putting in the starter. So I'll put my bowl here on the weight, or on the scale rather, zero it out. Okay, perfect. And I need 426 grams of the flour. So this here is a mixture of, it's unbleached flour, all-purpose flour, some from King Arthur, some from this brand called Heckers because they were out of more King Arthur, and then I added a little bit of wheat flour as well, whole wheat flour from King Arthur, all unbleached, which is very important. So I'm going to measure this out first, and then I'll add the starter, beer, flour, etc. So let's see. They're anticipating it'll be about 3.5 cups. So we'll see. We're at 137, 271 grams, 382, 469. We're over. I imagine the whole wheat flour is a little heavier. That's close enough. Perfect. Okay, so we have that sorted. Now we need to get the starter. It also says that you can use a little yeast, I think, if your starter isn't active, which I'm not going to worry about at this point in time. For the starter, I need 1 cup or 227 grams. So what I'm going to do is actually take this off for the moment. I'll use my measuring cup here. we'll zero that out and grab my spatula. There we go. Okay, so they tell you if the starter is active, they kind of want you to mix it all together first and then measure it out. And we'll do 227 grams. Oh, it smells so good. Oh, there we are. All right, it's nearly 1 cup. Okay. Good to go in there. Okay, perfect. Got a little bit more than we need, but we'll add this to our flour. Perfect. All right, good to go here. All right, and then the next thing we need to do is add the beer. So with this Nitro Stout, it's a very specific sort of way that you have to pour it. Another measuring cup and tablespoons. Okay. It's called a hard pour. And then I think you do this. Okay. And then you just let it sit for a little bit. You'll see all the nice sediment on this. A lovely beer. So we're gonna let that settle for a second. Keep reading. So the first step, once all this is done, is gonna be what's called Autolyse. So once we combine the starter, the beer, the flour, yeast if you were using it, I'm gonna mix this by hand. Took off all the rings. It'll be like this sticky sort of mass that I'll cover and let rest for about 30 minutes. Perry is tasting the beer, which seems unnecessary. We're pretty sure it's good. So I'm guessing it's okay to pour it now. Okay, so let me get a cup. And 2 tablespoons. All right, great. And a little for me. Oh, it's lovely. All right, let's pour this beer in. Oh, it's such a pretty color. All right. Okay, so we have the starter, we have the beer, we have the flour. I'm not using yeast. Let's get in there. Off the wash. All right. Rewash, just why not? Why not? Won't hurt. Okay, here we go. You can do this in the stand mixer. I've been kind of experimenting with doing bread in the stand mixer versus by hand, and I feel like it tastes better when it's done by hand, like that it's less dense and airy, and I don't know. Maybe it's just me. Plus, this is the fun part. And I have time. All right, so most of you been able to this. Keep going. Cohesive, somewhat sticky mass. Apparently, if I was doing this in a stand mixer, it would be about 3 minutes on low speed. Now remember, for my other sourdough recipe, you want to make sure to get all the flour bits off the side if you can. incorporated. There are lots of good videos on YouTube. Like if you look up like sourdough Autolyse, they'll show you different videos on how to get this all incorporated. I feel like this is definitely a somewhat sticky, cohesive mass, but I'll keep going until the flour seems incorporated a bit more. Oh yes, off the hands. That's fun. Okay. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay. Now what I might do is add a smidge more flour. We'll see. So that's pretty sticky. And just a little bit. Try not to contaminate that. It'll also help to get this flour off my hands, dough off my hands a little bit. I don't want to miss using any of what I hope is going to be a very delicious bread. Alrighty. And one more mix in. Yeah, that's better. Still sticky, but cohesive. Roll it in on itself. So this I think is pretty good, and we're gonna let this rest for about 30 minutes or so. And then at that point, we'll mix in that soaker of the rye flakes, about a tablespoon of honey, and about 2 teaspoons of salt. Whenever you're working with yeast, the salt is kind of I believe, can sometimes inactivate the yeast a little bit. So it's always added at a particular time during the recipe to avoid that. So what I've learned, at least. All right, so this is kind of what your sticky mass is gonna look like. And I'm gonna cover this and let it rest, and then we'll see what it looks like after. All right, so it's been probably more like 45 minutes because I threw in some sourdough discard crackers in the meantime. Also, I decided I did not want like chunky bits of the rye flake in the bread, so I threw the rye flakes into my little Cuisinart, add a little bit more beer to it to make sure that it doesn't get too dry, because I was thinking when I blended it that maybe then it might make the bread too dense. Who knows? It's an experiment. I experiment with my regular cooking. I don't tend to experiment with baking because it tends to mess it up. So fingers crossed. So the next step is we're meant to take this soaker here, add in a tablespoon of honey, 2 teaspoons of salt, mix that all in with the dough. I'm going to knead it for a bit, then I'm going to cover it again and let it rest for an hour, and then I'll start doing this fold method. I forgot, flip and fold. There's a name for it. I'll figure it out. It's not flip and fold. It is, hold on, pull and fold, I believe. Stretch and fold. Is it stretch and fold, honey? Look at you. Stretch and fold. Good job. It is right. It's stretch and fold. So after this 1 hour rest, I'll do a stretch and fold, cover again, let it rest for an hour, stretch and fold. So I'm kind of combining the King Arthur recipe with the very first sourdough I made, and that'll also kind of change how I actually bake it and everything. And then after I do probably like 3 or 4 sessions of the stretch and fold, depending on how the dough feels, we'll do the overnight bulk fermentation and then bake this up in the morning. So, all right, so here is our soaker here. I'm gonna add in 2 teaspoons of salt. I took sea salt, add some coarse sea salt. I just put it in my mortar and pestle and made it fine, so it'll blend in. Oh, I thought for sure you would do some sort of cheesy joke, but you didn't. All right, so that's 1 teaspoon. I think it should be exactly 2. There we go. 2 teaspoons of salt there. And then we will do a tablespoon of honey. I'm just gonna mix it in with the soaker and then mix all that in with the dough. There we go. Beautiful. Yeah, every little bit. Oops. Lost a flake. Okay, perfect. That's probably good. Good. Okay. So I'll mix it in here. Okay. And now I'll dump this in here. And then we'll get this all incorporated. More kneading. Okay. Alright. Ooh, nice and sticky. Just gonna kind of pull from under. And just try to get it in. It feels so weird / cool. I'm gonna try to do a one-handed knead. There we go. Yeah, so get this all incorporated. There we go. Just gonna pull in the sides, keep pulling in and under. It smells like beer in here. I'm guessing if it's 3 minutes in a stand mixer, it would be more by hand. Unclear. So the dough is supposed to be smooth and supple, but somewhat soft and tacky. So I'm gonna keep mixing and kneading like so. Then I'm gonna actually take some saran wrap, cover the bowl, and let it rest for an hour. And that'll be it. All right, so it has been an hour or so of this resting, and so what I'm gonna do now is turn this out onto a lightly floured surface, which I don't know, this is kind of lightly floured. And then I'm gonna do my first session of the stretch and fold. Let's see if this dumps out. Nope. All right, so I have my little scraper here. Smells good still, which is nice. Okay, so turn this stickiness out. So with sourdough, you really don't want to knead it too much because you want to keep all the air in. So that's why you do the stretch and fold. So I'm going to take this area, I'll do the area furthest away from me, stretch it up, fold it to the middle, just like that. And then you kind of do a quarter turn. Same thing, kind of pull out from the bottom, stretch, and pull it over. Quarter turn, stretch, pull it over, and then last one, stretch, and pull it over. And that's it. So now I'm going to cover it, let it rest for an hour, and in an hour, I'm going to do that same thing again. Let it rest for another hour, and then I'm going to do it a third time. You can get away with 1 or 2, but I really like to try and get as much air in the dough as possible. So I'm going to do 3. I'm going to make a section out of it, and then that's about it. So I won't record the next 2 stretch and folds after this. I'll show you what happens after the third, which will basically be a bulk fermentation. It's going to rise overnight. Here we go. Okay, so I've done 3 sets of the stretch and fold, and now what I'm going to do is put the dough back into the bowl, and I'm going to let it do a bulk ferment overnight for 4 to 7 hours. It's about midnight right now, so let's say 7 hours. I'll set an alarm for 7 o'clock. At this point, just going to lift this bad boy up gently. I'll do a final one. Gently like this. The trick is to wet your hands so the dough doesn't stick to your fingers. And you don't want to overstretch the dough, just as far as it wants to let you go, like so. Okay, so cover this. And then we'll check in on it again in the morning. Good morning, guys. So I let the dough rise on the table overnight, also known as the bulk fermentation phase. I accidentally ordered like 100 shower caps on Amazon one night, but they're really coming in handy with this bread baking. And I noticed that about 4 had gotten quite big, and I didn't want it to overproof, so then I popped it in the fridge. So now we're gonna do the final shape and rise, and I need to grab a different bowl to actually put it in. I'm intending on baking this in my Dutch oven that is about 9 inches in diameter, and I have a bowl that also at its max is about 9 inches in diameter. So I don't have a banneton or broke form as of yet. I've tried to order them, but because everyone and their mother is making bread, they're out everywhere. But I was able to get a bread lame off Amazon from Bread Bosses, so you know, that's something, silver lining. Sorry, having trouble getting these rings off. All right, so let me put some more dough on this table. Sorry, more flour on this table before I put the dough on. Oi, these fingers. So I'm gonna wash my hands. Actually, we'll do flour, then wash hands. So a little bit more flour, wash hands. Okay, so now we're gonna get this out of here. Ooh. I'm gonna try and keep as much air in this as possible. Okay, let's see if I can, oh yeah, it's loose. Beautiful, okay. Ooh, food. Okay. All right, so got that fella. Now we're going to shape the dough into a ball by pulling 4 sides of the dough into the middle of itself. Then I'm going to turn the dough seam side down and then try to form it into like a little ball with tight skin. And then I'm going to place that on parchment paper and then in the bowl that I'm going to finally proof it in. If you had a banneton or broil form, you would place it in that instead with that surface lightly floured. So, okay. We did something like fold 1. So cold. 2. I'm gonna try to do it as here with the 4 sides, but we'll see. It's pretty big. 3. And again, I'm being very careful to try and not take any of this air out. Oh, there's a nice big bubble. Stay in there, bubble. 4. 5. Okay. And then I flip it over like so. And then you kind of go like this. You cup it. And you're just trying to make it a nice, smooth, and tight ball. Like so. And this will ultimately end up being the shape of your final loaf. And there's a nice bubble there. So that looks, I think, pretty bread-like. So let me grab my bowl. parchment. I'm going to end up baking it in my Dutch oven on this parchment paper as well. So I'm going to use this to lift the bread, to lift the bread ball. There we go. Into my Dutch oven later. I'm also just gonna, I don't normally flour the parchment, but this is a really sticky dough. And this is gonna be like a rise, so just wanna be extra careful. We got the flour here, so why not? Okay. You can also, if you don't have parchment, you can take a tea towel, flour the tea towel, and let it do its final rise in the tea towel. Obviously, don't bake it in the tea towel then, but okay, let's pick this fella up. So then, shower cap. Cover this bad boy. This is gonna rise for another, I don't know, hour or so. But I also need to preheat the oven and get the Dutch oven preheated. I'll be cooking in the Dutch oven and spritzing with water. So I'm gonna turn on the oven now to 450. And then the final thing we'll do is break out my new bread lane. Very excited about that. So, breakfast bread incoming. Okay, it's time for the bread to go into the oven. I rubbed a little bit of olive oil on top, and then I'm just gonna, I'm gonna sop up any of the big puddles. All right, then I'm gonna spray this with a bit of water, because this will help with oven spring when I throw it into the Dutch oven. Create some steam. And that's probably good. And my bread lane. All right, here we go. Got that all in place. And we're gonna try and do some fancy scoring. We'll see how this goes. So we'll go. Ooh. I don't know how fancy this is gonna be. That looks cool. And then maybe I'll go like this, 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 this. This could look crazy, guys. I'm not real sure. I googled a couple videos. Here we go. Feel like I need to scoot this up a little bit. There we go, I do. There we go, that's better. And then I'm gonna correct this one. Okay, we have this one going here, and then I'm gonna do a big one around there, and a big one around there. Okay, I'm trying to use the same corner of this guy. And I'll kind of mark it so I know for next time. Because you always want to use a really sharp razor. This is a pretty wet dough, so that's why I'm wiping it off. Get this corner down here. Okay, uniformity. Under the skin a little bit. So we do that here. Perfect. And under the skin here. You can see the little gas bubbles. So cool. we'll see how this bakes up. So I'm going to pop this into my Dutch oven that's been in the oven already for about 45 minutes with the oven on 425. I'm going to bake it covered for 25 minutes and then uncover it for the last bit of baking for another 20 minutes till it's golden brown. Okay, the 20-minute timer's done, so we're going to pop the lid off this bad boy. It smells like beer in here, which I think is the idea. Ooh. All right. Okay, so now we're gonna bake it for an additional 25-30 minutes or so, or until it gets pretty golden brown, like real brown and crusty. That's not so bad on my first attempt at the bread lame, I think. All right. There's still like 10 minutes left on the clock, but I like to do sneaky peeks of the bread, which is probably not what you're supposed to do, but whatever, it's my kitchen. Oh, I think that's looking good. How close can you get in there? Oh yeah, it's blurry, but and hot. The timer's gone off. I'm gonna see how this is looking, or if it needs to go for a little longer. Oopsie daisies. I think that, oh shoot, looks okay. That sounds right. Let me see, let me check the bottom of this fella. I mean, I think that's good. We're gonna take it out and let it cool. Let me turn off the oven. And then we'll do a little video when we decide to cut into it. Okay, here's the bottom. And we'll see. That's a good one. Okay, so full disclosure, I ended up popping it back into the oven without the parchment because one of the corners didn't seem very like crispy yet. This one over here, actually. It's pretty good on all their sides. Be careful when you're doing this. So I'm gonna let it go for about 5 more minutes just to see if it can crisp up. I'm okay with it getting really brown on the top. It'll just be good bits. Okay, let's see how it's looking. Oh, I think that already looks better. Yes, that looks good. Crusty all around, carefully. Yeah, we're good. Taking it out again, for real this time. Resting time. All right, we're gonna cut into this loaf. Here's hoping. Burying his bread cutting technique. That's a whole other story. I don't know if this means that the knife has been cutting through too much bread, or how's it look?
Oh, looks good, looks good.
Looks good?
Oh, yeah.
How's it smelling?
Oh, yeah.
Smell like beer?
Oh, yeah, smells like boiled bread.
Well, it smells like bread.
Oh, yeah, it looks good, right?
Yeah, I think it looks good. There's holes there. Mmm.
Oh, yeah.
Caught yourself. All right, looking good. We're going to butter this up and do a taste test.